Snow fell like forgotten prayers upon the pines, drifting through the night in a hush so complete it felt as though the world itself were holding its breath. The radio in Officer Ellard Rowan's truck murmured with static, the kind that carried loneliness rather than words. He had been driving the back roads since dusk, the tires hissing over thin ice, answering a faint distress call that no one else had bothered to take. An indistinct report of a sound coming from the woods. Something like crying. In this town, most calls ended in silence. Still he went. That was who Ellard was. The kind of man who responded to echoes, even when they weren't meant for him. The forest closed around the road, tall spruce and birch forming solemn silhouettes. The world here had no color, only shades of gray and white, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. His breath fogged against the windshield. He thought of how winters had always taken something from him. First his father to the mines, then his wife and unborn child to a blizzard he could not outrun. Now he lived in the cold the way others lived in faith. Quietly, habitually, and without expecting warmth in return. The wind shifted, carrying a thin sound, a whimper so frail it could have been mistaken for the cry of the wind itself. He stopped the truck and killed the engine. The silence pressed in, heavy and watchful. For a moment he hesitated. The woods at night could swallow a man's sense of direction and reason both. But something in the sound, something living, called to a place in him still capable of care. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the snow. Each step cracked the crust of ice, the noise oddly loud against the hush of the forest. The beam of light trembled across a scatter of paw prints leading off the trail. They were deep and erratic, as if the creature had stumbled. He followed them through drifts that came up to his knees, breathing in cold so sharp it burned his lungs. The forest seemed endless, its silence broken only by the groan of trees under snow and that intermittent whimper, faint but insistent. Then he saw her. A German shepherd half buried near a fallen pine branch, her fur crusted with ice. She tried to rise when the light found her, but one leg refused to obey, pinned beneath the branch. Her belly was swollen, taut beneath the frost, and her eyes, when they met his, held both terror and a strange, fragile trust. The sight hit him like a pulse. Something in the tilt of her gaze, the tremor of her breath, cracked the frozen quiet inside his chest. "It's all right, girl," he murmured, his voice unsteady from disuse. "You're not alone now." He knelt in the snow, brushing ice from her fur with his gloved hands. The branch was heavy but brittle from the cold. He levered it off with a grunt, careful not to startle her further. She whimpered once, then went still, as if surrendering to the sound of his voice. When he lifted her, she was lighter than she should have been. Her ribs pressed through her coat. Her heartbeat fluttered weakly against his arm. He wrapped her in his jacket, the fabric soaking quickly with melted snow. Back at the truck, the heater blasted lukewarm air. He laid her across the passenger seat and looked at her again, the frost thawing from her lashes. The town shelter would be too cold, too crowded. He thought of one place, a cabin at the edge of town, where a woman lived alone with too many animals and too few visitors. People whispered about her, said she was strange, said she spoke more to the broken than the living. Her name was Mara Lysel. Ellard didn't know her well, but he trusted her hands. As he drove toward her cabin, the dog's breathing grew steadier. Every few minutes she lifted her head weakly as if to be sure he hadn't vanished. The road wound through hills smothered in snow. Windows of distant houses glowed faintly, their warmth unreachable. The town had long since given up on Ellard Rowan, the officer who smiled too little, talked too softly, and still set flowers by a grave no one visited anymore. But he didn't drive for them. He drove because saving one life, even a small one, was the only thing that still felt real. When he reached Mara's clearing, the night had deepened to ink. Smoke curled from her chimney, dissolving into snowflakes. The cabin stood like a lantern in the darkness. He carried the shepherd to the door and knocked softly. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then the door opened just enough for warm air to spill out, carrying the faint scent of herbs and burning cedar. Mara's face appeared in the crack of light. Pale, sharp-boned, eyes as calm and deep as lake water under ice. Her hair was unbound, falling over her shoulders in dark waves. She looked at the bundle in his arms, then at him. No questions, no surprise, just quiet understanding. "Bring her in," she said. The inside of the cabin glowed in amber light. Blankets were folded on every surface. Jars of medicine lined the shelves. Animals lay curled in corners. An old cat, a limping rabbit, a crow perched near the stove. Ellard laid the dog down on a blanket by the fire. Mara knelt beside her, running gentle fingers over the swollen belly, the injured leg. "She's close," Mara said, her voice low, steady. And she's been alone too long. Iliard watched her hands move. Sure. Careful. Reverent. Her presence quieted the room, as though the storm outside bowed its head. He felt awkward, out of place in his uniform and heavy boots. Yet something inside him unknotted. Mara didn't ask why he'd brought the dog, or what he hoped to do next. She simply worked, humming under her breath, a sound like memory itself. "I'll leave her in your care," he said at last, rising reluctantly. Mara didn't look up. "If you leave her now, she'll think she's been abandoned again. Dogs remember the cold longer than we do." The words struck deeper than she intended. He hesitated, then sat down by the fire. The warmth seeped into his gloves, into the ache of his fingers. For a while they said nothing. The dog's breathing evened out. The storm howled softly beyond the walls. He thought of how long it had been since he had shared silence with another person, without it feeling like punishment. Mara offered him tea in a clay cup. The steam smelled faintly of mint and something older. She studied him. Not with curiosity, but with a recognition that made him uneasy, as though she saw the same frost clinging to his soul that still covered the trees outside. "You carry ghosts," she said finally, not unkindly. Iliard stared into the fire. "Don't we all?" She didn't press further. Instead, she reached for a small tin and applied balm to the dog's paws. The act was so tender that it felt like a prayer. Iliard realized his hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar warmth of the moment. The hours stretched softly. Outside, the snow thickened, draping the world in white silence. Inside, time moved slower, measured by the flicker of flame and the steady rise and fall of the shepherd's chest. At some point, Mara spoke again, her tone almost a whisper. "She's going to make it," she said, "but she'll need care and quiet. She trusts you already." He looked at the dog, at the faint light glinting off her fur. "Trust," he murmured almost to himself. "That's a word I haven't earned in a while." Mara met his eyes for the first time. There was something ancient in her gaze, a patience carved by solitude. "Maybe it's not about earning," she said. "Maybe it's about being willing to stay." Outside, the wind changed direction, brushing snow against the window in soft sighs. Iliard glanced toward it, then back at the fire. The warmth, the quiet, the flicker of something fragile but alive. It all felt unfamiliar, like finding a door in a house he thought he'd locked years ago. When he finally rose to leave, the dog lifted her head and whimpered softly. He paused at the door. Mara's voice followed him, gentle but firm. "She'll remember the sound of your voice. Come back tomorrow. The cold is no place for promises." He nodded once. The air outside was sharp, biting, but it no longer felt entirely empty. As he walked back to the truck, the snow muffled his steps, erasing his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. Behind him the cabin glowed, a small, golden defiance against the vast, indifferent night. Driving back through the forest, he thought of how some rescues were never about the ones we found in the snow, but about what we uncovered in ourselves when we stopped running from the quiet. By the time he reached town, dawn was only a pale shimmer behind the clouds. The world would wake soon, full of gossip and routine, but for now there was peace in the stillness. He parked by the station, sat for a long moment with his hands on the wheel, and whispered into the silence, as if the wind might carry the words back to that cabin. "You're not alone anymore." In the distance, a lone crow rose from the trees, its wings cutting across the pale light. The snow caught the morning's first gleam, and for the first time in years, Iliard felt the faint, impossible warmth of something breaking through the frost. And somewhere in the woods behind him, a dog dreamed by a fire, her breath syncing with the rhythm of the storm's retreat, a quiet promise that not all winters are meant to last. The snow had not stopped in 3 days, yet the world around Mara's cabin seemed to hum with an undercurrent of quiet life. Each morning, Officer Iliard Rowan arrived with supplies, firewood strapped to his truck bed, a thermos of coffee cooling beside him, his uniform dusted white by the storm. He never said much when he entered, only nodded to Mara, hung his hat by the door, and crouched beside the hearth where the German shepherd rested. They'd named her Solace, though neither could remember who said it first. The name fit her, the way she moved carefully now, each step deliberate, her eyes bright with guarded gratitude. The pups had not yet come, but Mara said it would be soon. Solace's breaths were heavier these days, her belly shifting as life stirred beneath her ribs. Sometimes Iliard would rest his hand against her side, feeling the faint kicks of unborn hearts. It filled him with something he could not name, something he feared to call hope. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, its howls softened by the steady crackle of the fire. The cabin smelled of pine resin, wet fur, and the faint sweetness of tea. In that small golden room, Eliard found a rhythm that slowed the ache inside him. He chopped wood while Mara mended blankets. He fetched water from the well while she fed the animals. They spoke little, but every silence felt full rather than empty. When their eyes met across the glow of the fire, a flicker of understanding passed between them, unspoken, steady, like the pulse of warmth beneath winter's weight. Still, the town's whispers found their way through the cold. At the station, Deputy Clay Harvin leaned against the counter with a smirk. "You're spending a lot of time up at that cabin, Eli. Folks are starting to think you've gone soft for the Witch of the Woods." Eliard didn't answer. He finished his paperwork, signed his name, and walked out without looking back. Behind him, laughter followed, a brittle sound that crumbled in the air. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled so fiercely it seemed to scrape the sky raw. Eliard returned to the cabin just as the last light faded, snow stinging his face, his breath thick in the dark. Inside, Mara was kneeling by Solace, her hands trembling as she stroked the dog's head. "It's time," she whispered. He went to her side. The firelight flickered across the walls, shadows dancing like specters. Solace panted hard, her body rippling with effort. Eliard felt helpless at first, caught between fear and awe. Mara guided him gently. "Hold her still. Talk to her. She needs to hear something steady," so he did. He whispered nonsense at first, fragments of words he hadn't spoken in years. "You're doing fine, girl. You're strong. It's all right. I'm right here." His voice broke, but Solace responded, pressing her muzzle against his arm as if drawing strength from it. Hours passed in a haze of heat and snowlight. When the first pup came, Eliard caught his breath. Tiny, trembling, slick with the shimmer of birth. Life, impossibly small and loud, filled the room. Solace nudged it close to her belly, licking it with fierce devotion. Then another came, and another, until 5 little hearts pulsed against the warmth of the blanket. Mara exhaled deeply, exhaustion softening her features into something almost tender. "See?" she murmured, smiling faintly. "Even winter delivers life, if you wait long enough." Eliard looked at the newborns, at Solace resting with her eyes half closed in relief, and felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking on a river's surface to reveal the current beneath. He hadn't realized how much of himself he'd buried until that moment, when the sound of those small, fragile breaths filled the silence that used to echo with ghosts. He stayed until dawn. The storm had quieted by then, leaving the world washed clean. When he stepped outside, the first light touched the treetops, turning the snow into pale gold. He stood there for a while, listening to the faint mewls from within the cabin, and for the first time in years, he smiled without forcing it. But peace, in small towns, never lasted long. Word of the puppies spread faster than the thaw. By noon, Clay had driven up the mountain, his boots crunching over the snow as he shouted from his truck. "Eli, you can't just keep them up here. You know the shelter's full, and folks are complaining about strays near their property." "They're not strays," Eliard said, his tone low. Clay snorted. "Dogs, woman, officer. It's all the same story with you, isn't it? Always rescuing what don't need rescuing." Mara stepped onto the porch, her shawl drawn tight. "They do need rescuing," she said quietly. "You just don't know what it means to be lost." The deputy muttered something under his breath and turned away, but Eliard knew the damage was done. The town would twist this into something it wasn't. They always did. Later that evening, a letter came from the sheriff himself, official, impersonal, ordering that all animals found outside proper registration were to be relocated. That night, Eliard couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire with Solace's pups curled near his boots. Mara watched him from across the room, her eyes soft with worry. "You'll lose your badge if you go against them," she said. He shook his head. "Then I'll lose it. Some things shouldn't be left to die just because rules make it easier." Outside, the storm began again, wilder, colder. The windows rattled, and the snow pressed against the door like a living thing. In that roaring silence, Eliard made his decision. "They'll come for them," he said, "and if they do, I'll be here." The next morning, the storm had turned the world to silver haze. He stood outside the cabin in full uniform, his coat drawn tight, his breath steaming in the air. The woods were eerily still. Time passed, an hour, 2. No one came. Only the distant creak of trees and the occasional cry of a raven broke the quiet. Then a gunshot echoed through the forest. Eliard's body went rigid. He followed the sound, heart pounding. The trail led toward the frozen river, where the wind whipped across the ice in furious gusts. There, beyond the pines, he saw Solace, limping, her paw caught in a trap half buried in snow. The sharp metal gleamed like teeth. She barked once, a desperate, broken sound. He ran. The ice groaned beneath his boots as he slid to his knees beside her. Blood darkened the snow around the trap. He pried at it with shaking hands, the metal biting into his gloves. Solace whimpered, her breath misting in shallow bursts. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice ragged. "Please, girl, stay with me." The ice cracked. He heard it before he felt it, the low, resonant snap that crawled through his bones. The river beneath was alive and angry, its current snarling beneath the frozen shell. He tried to pull her free, but his foot slipped, the surface splitting wide. In an instant, the world plunged into chaos. Cold water, shattering sound, blinding white. He caught her by instinct. Both of them half submerged, gasping. The cold knifed into his lungs. For a heartbeat, he thought of the night he lost his wife, of the blizzard and the helplessness, of the silence that followed. Not this time. He would not lose her too. With a final wrench, the trap gave way. He dragged her up, every muscle screaming until they collapsed together on the bank. Solace was shaking violently but alive. She licked his cheek once, brief, trembling, before pressing her head against his chest. He laughed, breathless, tears freezing at the corners of his eyes. "You're all right," he whispered. "We're all right." When they returned to the cabin, Mara met them at the door, her face pale with relief. She helped him wrap Solace in blankets, rubbed warmth into her limbs, and set a bowl of broth near the pups. The fire burned bright and steady, throwing long ribbons of light across the walls. Eliard sat beside it, soaked to the bone, trembling less from cold than from the strange, dizzy gratitude swelling in his chest. Later, as the storm ebbed, he looked at Mara. She was tending to Solace, her hands moving with care that could have mended the world if it would only sit still long enough. When she glanced at him, something unspoken passed between them again. Recognition, respect, maybe something deeper. No promises, no declarations. Just the quiet certainty of two lives thawing beside the same flame. Weeks passed. The town's gossip softened, replaced by reluctant admiration. People began sending blankets, leftover food, old collars. A man who'd once complained about strays brought firewood, muttering that it was just to keep the roads clear. Still, Eliard noticed the way his name changed when spoken in the cafe. No longer with pity, but with a quiet kind of regard. He kept one of the pups, a small one with a gray streak across its back. He named him Ashen, after the color of the morning sky that had saved them. Solace healed slowly, limping but proud. Sometimes, when she stood by the firelight, her eyes reflected the same calm strength that had once belonged to the woman he lost, and he wondered if the universe had found a way to give back what it had taken. Mara and Eliard never spoke of what they were to each other. They didn't need to. Their connection lived in gestures, the shared tea in the quiet hours, the unspoken understanding when their hands brushed as they reached for the same piece of firewood. It was enough. When the snow finally began to melt, Eliard walked to the river one last time. The ice was gone, replaced by the murmur of running water. Solace trotted beside him, her steps slow but steady. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine. He watched the current glint under the sun and felt the warmth spread through him like a small, steady fire. Years later, when the woods had grown quiet with age and his hair had gone to silver, he would still visit that place. He would stand by the river, the sound of rushing water filling the air, and think of that winter, the one that took his silence and gave him back his heart. He would whisper to the wind, "Some rescues change more than one life." And perhaps, somewhere beyond hearing, the forest would whisper back. If this story found its way to you, if it touched a quiet place you'd forgotten you still had, remember, every act of kindness leaves a trail through the cold. Follow it. And if you believe in second chances, in warmth waiting beneath the snow, stay a while. Subscribe for more whispered tales.